If Australian politicians have bold ideas, they need to be very carefully thought through. They need to be supported by persuasive communications, evidence-based argument, and consistent communications. Chifley did not do this.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In 1947, the Chifley government made a bold and pretty controversial move, an attempt to nationalise Australia's private banks. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the nation, igniting legal challenges, ideological warfare, and one of the most intense public campaigns Australia had ever seen. At the heart of it all was a fierce clash, not just over policy, but over a philosophy. And the clash brought together two titans of Australian politics in Prime Minister Ben Chifley and his rival Robert Menzies. The fight over bank nationalisation in the late 40s would reshape Australia's political landscape. For Robert Menzies, it became a defining issue and one that re-energised his return to the Prime Ministership and laid the groundwork for his long post-war dominance until 1966. This period also ushered in a new era of political communication, with both sides deploying unprecedented advertising and marketing strategies. And Menzies himself took to the road in a groundbreaking barnstorming tour of the country. Joining me to talk about this Battle of the Banks is author Bob Crawshaw. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Bob.
Thank you very much, Georgina.
Well, you've written a wonderful new book about the bank nationalisation issue, Battle of the Banks. We've had a few people on over the years to talk about bank nationalisation because it is, of course, such a pivotal issue that really leads Menzies to the Prime Ministership for his second time in 1949. And some would argue that Ben Chifley actually makes the Liberal Party delivering this election victory and really sharpening their political attack on the Chifley agenda, but also giving them something to really fight for and make the case for their Liberal agenda. You have had an extensive career serving in the Australian Army, of all places, and then in public relations, so you're obviously interested in communications and persuasion. What made you go back to the 1940s to want to write this book?
Well, Georgina, my last job in the Army was Director of Army Public Affairs, and I got very interested in how governments communicate to people. When I left the Army, I continued on in a public relations and marketing career. And when I retired, I thought I would like to write a book about the 5 campaigns that had shaped Australian history. And I knew a bit about bank nationalisation, but I knew it was a pivotal campaign. So I thought, okay, I'll start with that one first. 6 years later, and many hours in libraries and archives, etc. I fell in love with that particular story, particularly the two legendary figures that dominate that story, Ben Chifley and Robert Menzies. And I was intrigued by the passions that the bank nationalisation episode stirred in post-war Australia. So of the campaigns I set out to write about, I never got past bank nationalisation, hence Battle for the Banks.
This podcast is going to be about the Battle of the Banks, but just for completeness, what were the other topics you were going to look at?
Good question. I had looked at how the colonies of Australia set about to encourage principally British, Irish and Scottish migrants to come and migrate to Australia, and there's some interesting campaigns there.
Yeah, bring out of Britain.
Yeah. And after the First World War, there were two quite revolutionary campaigns. One was to raise funds for the Melbourne Shrine, and that hadn't been done before. That was highly successful. And a couple of years later, there was a commercial campaign to launch the train service, the Spirit of Sydney, and that was very effective. And then the other campaign I looked at was the 1967 referendum, which was not only a successful result, but it was a very well constructed set of government communications. They were the others waiting in the background if ever I got off Battle for the Banks.
Well, there's still time yet, Bob. They all sound like very worthy topics, and I would be interested to read books on all of them. But time is afoot today, and we're going to focus on bank nationalisation. It's interesting taking the perspective of the campaign, the communications campaign here, because normally the story we talk about here at the Menzies Institute is about obviously the attack on nationalisation, on socialisation, and those sort of two divergent pathways Australia could have gone down if they stuck with Chifley or, as the Australian public did, chose the Menzies route. But as a communications campaign, was this a sort of a coming-of-age moment for the communications profession in the late 40s over the bank nationalisation campaign?
I would say that it is probably the first time in Australian political history that a public policy issue has been debated in such a strategically well thought out, very well executed and heavily resourced fashion. So Australia had, at the end of the war, a sophisticated and quite extensive mass media in terms of newspapers and radios and cinema, but there were a whole lot of new ideas grafted onto that came into effect in this campaign. So what we find is the bank nationalisation episode is contested in newspapers right across the country, from small parish affairs to syndicated journals to, your big capital city press. You've got radio heavily involved, both in a news sense and also in terms of programs which specifically target voters and are very creative. You've got rallies and meetings. You've got what we now call AstroTurf organisations. That is, community groups that are set up, some of them are set up by the banks, but many are supported by the banks to resist the idea of bank nationalisation. You mentioned at the start, Georgina, Menzies undertakes at the start of 1949 a presidential-like roadshow in which he tours Australia. Now, that was conceived as a media and publicity campaign and was the first time outside of an election that a major political figure had toured Australia. Now, Menzies called it his listening tour. We've heard that phrase before. To see what...
Yeah, it hasn't died a death, that phrase, has it? It's still still in use.
And so he was not only listening to the issues which were concerning Australians, but also selling the liberal philosophy. And he's doing this 6 months out before an election is called. Now, this is the first time that's happened. Then you've got the use of film, newsreels, third-party influences, especially by the banks who are working through well-known third-party organisations and individuals. And right in 1949, you've even got comic books coming out about the election, and you've got also some cartoon characters. So all of this coalesces into a very highly orchestrated, very effective campaign. And I think we also see the intersection of 5 people who are pretty influential in putting all this together from the Liberal side. First of all, there was Richard Casey, who'd be well known to the Institute's members, later became the Governor-General, but in 1947 he was the federal president of the Liberal Party. He had spent the war years both in Britain, in the Middle East, but before that as the equivalent today to the Australian ambassador in Washington. Casey was a very inquisitive, curious man, and he'd seen how public relations were being used by US politicians and by US corporations to advance their agenda. He brought a lot of those ideas back. He was also a ferocious and very effective fundraiser. And all of these new ideas cost money, and Richard Casey went out and got that money. Keeping with the Melbourne theme, there was an advertising executive called Frank Goldberg. Now, Goldberg is an expert in print advertising, and he introduces some innovative techniques for the banks and runs a very sophisticated 2-year program featuring a fictitious family which emphasise bank values and take the occasional opportunity early on to punch Ben Chifley on the nose, and as the election gets closer, to really go in hard on bank nationalisation.
His fictionalised show, was this connected to Richard Casey's activities, or they were in parallel to each other?
This is in parallel, but directly connected with Richard Casey is the John Henry Austral series. Now, Richard Casey, when he becomes federal president, he's not happy with the results of the 1946 election. No one in the Liberal Party is, because it's been a defeat. But in particular, he attributes some of that defeat to the communications. So that one of the first things he does is get a public relations officer, and also he goes looking for the best advertising agency he could find. Now, this is run by a fellow called Sim Rubinson, who's up in Sydney, who, with great irony, is the Labor Party advertising agency. Now, Rubinson and his creative director, a chap called Pip Coggan, have been so disappointed with bank nationalisation that they jumped ship and joined the Liberal effort. Rubinson suggests to Casey that radio shouldn't just be used for political speeches, that it can be used in an entertaining way. And he provides a program called John Henry Austral. John Henry Austral is a fictitious character played by Melbourne actor Richard Matthews, stentorian voiced, and each week for 2 years, John Henry Austral points out, almost in parable format, but highly entertaining with stirring music and a colourful cast of characters, the shortcomings of a socialist system and the benefits of free enterprise.
And Bob, was it known by the listener that this was associated with the Liberal Party, this John Henry Austral
Yes.
series? So there was some transparency there, and it was obviously entertaining.
Not only was it entertaining, but at the end of every show, there was the statement that it had been brought to you by the Liberal Party. But it was highly effective. It was, in fact, so effective that in early 1949, the government passed legislation to ban radio programs dealing with political issues younger than 5 years, which effectively took out the John Henry Austral series on bank nationalisation.
And there wasn't a challenge to that under the, I guess actually the implied freedom of political communication in the Constitution. I don't think that case had happened by then. But, I mean, it's a pretty draconian piece of legislation on political communication, and obviously targeting the government's political opponents.
Well, I think it shows two things. I think it shows how effective that the program had been, that there was this broad-based prohibition, and it also shows how thin-skinned the Labor ministry had become by that stage, because they were being pounded every week. Now, what happens is John Henry Austral takes a more sedate format to comply with the legislation. But Casey and Rubinson then come up with another program called Country Quiz, and that is based on an American idea, and it is based on the popularity of quiz shows after the war. And again, this is directly attributed to the Liberal Party, so there was no hidden agenda. But what would happen is it would go from town to town, and there'd be a quiz show featuring local farmers or local personalities, etc., and they would answer questions. There'd be a musical interlude. It came over the Macquarie network. It ran for about 15 months. It was very effective, and the idea was that whoever won a local quiz would go into a district quiz, a state quiz, and a national quiz. It never quite achieved that, but it was a very successful and very clever piece of radio theatre. And the winner would win such things as free fertiliser or a firearm, for shooting rabbits on the farm or something like that. But more importantly, politically, the winner would win 2 minutes to talk about a favourite issue. And goodness, Georgina, if that favourite issue wasn't one of the issues Richard Casey and Robert Menzies were campaigning on.
What a coincidence.
So, my God, who would have guessed? So it was very clever. Now, Labor couldn't manage that. They were still looking at a radio microphone as being placed on a podium in a town hall, and it was a method to deliver a speech. They became a bit worried in 1949, and Chifley was encouraged to do a series of programs called Report to the Nation. And he did this over 40 episodes, but it couldn't compete with what the entertainment value that Casey had funded and Rubinstein had conceived and Macquarie Network had delivered. And what you've got is Chifley's raspy voice, sort of public service speak, and a raft of very dry statistics that I think even the most loyal Labor listener after the first or second episode would have turned off and switched to another soap opera or the football or something.
Or a quiz show, followed by a brief political message at the end.
And another fellow, we mentioned the road show. Rubinstein had suggested that Menzies go on the road so that the public could learn more about Menzies, the man, as well as the politician. So Menzies goes on the road, and I think in a great tribute to Sir Robert Menzies, the first place he goes is the coalfields of New South Wales. Now, this has been traditionally a very anti-Liberal area. It has been a hotbed of industrial dispute, but Menzies chooses that, and together with a fellow called Stuart Howard, who's his PR advisor, they put together a program where he speaks at rallies, he visits CWAs, he goes and talks to local Liberal branches, he does street walks, etc. And he repeats this right round Australia, and it is highly effective. So much so, after the New South Wales campaign, the president of the Miners' Union, who's a strong communist, reports back to the Labor Party that this man Menzies is getting too much favourable consideration from people like this. We need to do something. So you've got Stuart Howard doing that. And then you've got another figure who's sort of been lost to history called Meredith Preston Stanley. And Meredith Preston Stanley is so incensed with bank nationalisation that she starts up the Australian Women's Movement Against Socialism. And that becomes a very successful movement. They hold rallies, they advertise, but as importantly, they organise against Labor candidates in state by-elections and local government by-elections. So you've got all this money, you've got these new ideas coming in, and then you've got this 4 or 5 characters that are very innovative, all coming together at the same time. And that's what I think makes this such a compelling story.
Yeah, well, it is fascinating, the level of experimentation too that Richard Casey was prepared to undertake with the political communications. And there would have been a degree of risk to this. I mean, the quiz show could have gone pretty pear-shaped if you chose the wrong contestants. And, they obviously did some good investigations prior to the selection. And then, it wasn't just controlled by the Liberal Party too. They were relying on a coordinated effort with other communicators and of course, Millicent Preston Stanley, as you said, who develops the Australian Women's Movement Against Socialisation. Tell me, though, Bob, about how Chifley plays this, because he's faced with is quite sophisticated and developing in sophistication Liberal Party campaign against bank nationalisation. But when he announces his decision to nationalise the banks, It's a sort of perfunctory statement, isn't it? He doesn't sort of really try and win the community over in any sense, does he?
No, it's in fact, if you would have to name the most disastrous media release in Australian history, in any dimension, this would be up there with among the most disastrous. So what took place is 48 hours before Chifley very perfunctorily announces that he's going to nationalise the banks, the High Court has struck down a provision in some banking legislation which he has passed 2 years before, which is to continue the wartime control of the banks. So Chifley holds a meeting 24 hours after the High Court decision with a handful of public servants, 2 trusted ministerial advisors and the governor of the Commonwealth Bank. And the decision is made, or he leaves that meeting, determined to nationalise the banks. He runs it by caucus a couple of days later, and the caucus agrees. But at no stage is there any plan to communicate this to the Australian public. Quite remarkably, there is actually no plan or no blueprint on how the banks will be nationalised. That's all an afterthought. So Menzies attributes this sudden and very dramatic announcement that the government will nationalise the banks to Chifley having a fit of pique over the High Court ruling. And my goodness, it's hard to see, even after years with this story, why a politician as successful and as astute as Chifley took this particular action.
But when you think about the Labor Party's position on bank nationalisation, it had been a long-held position. I mean, James Scullin in the early 1930s had pushed it, and he was still involved, of course, politically through the rest of the 30s and early 40s. So, of course, the benefit of hindsight, we say, well, it was a disaster for Chifley, and Menzies and Casey and others are really effective at destroying his government over it. But he perhaps just saw it as, well, we've always said we would nationalise the banks. We deeply believe it. We're very concerned about what happened during the Great Depression and what the banks were able to do, and we need to take back control over the financial system.
That's right. Anyone that knew Chifley and followed him closely, as in fact the banks had, knew that Chifley had a long-term antipathy with the banks, and this dated back to his boyhood. Chifley had lived for a time with his grandfather on a farm outside Bathurst. His grandfather had suffered quite a significant financial loss in the 1890s bank crash. That always stayed with Chifley because he looked around, not only his grandfather, but the families of the kids he went to school with had also suffered and lost money. In 1935, Joe Lyons had appointed Chifley as a member of the Royal Commission into Banking, and Chifley had put in a minority report that what should happen is the banks should be nationalised for the good of the citizens of the Commonwealth. That was a minority report that obviously didn't go anywhere. It was overtaken by events of the Second World War. When you talk about Joseph Scullin, well, the Scullin government was so consumed with managing the Depression, it really never got the clear air to look closely at what the banks were doing. But it also led to this suspicion of the banks, the Depression era. Now, the first time Labor could control the banks was during the Second World War, when, let's face it, everyone in the economy was being controlled, and the bankers had no choice but to go along with it to contribute to the war effort. I think that Chifley did this may not have been such a surprise. It was a surprise to the average Australian that, didn't follow ALP politics and knew this was long-standing policy, and suddenly had this announcement on Saturday afternoon when they were more used to listening to the football scores or the racing results. I think to those that knew Chifley and knew what a clever administrator he was, the surprise was that it was so poorly handled.
Yeah, so in terms of his political messaging, as we would say today. They might not have used the same term back then. It was pretty inept, but he was popular. He'd won the 46 election. He was a wartime prime minister, just of course at the very end of the war. So perhaps there was a sense that he had the political capital to drive through this policy change once and for all.
Yes, first of all, he had the reason. The banks had successfully challenged part of his legislation in the High Court. Chifley was very wary and suspicious that they would challenge other pieces of legislation which he deemed necessary for the future of Australia to transform the economy from wartime production to peacetime purposes. He goes ahead and he makes that, but even though it's long-standing policy, there has never been a blueprint about how this thing should be done. It's been more talked about in the passing and certainly not in the detail. Now, Georgina, what I find remarkable is on the day Chifley makes this announcement, first of all, he writes the press release himself without consultation. 42 words.
42 words.
That was it.
That was it.
Which effectively said the government will introduce legislation to nationalise the banks in Australia.
Full stop.
Full stop. Now, what's amazing to me was in the next office to Chifley sits a chap called Don Rogers, and Don Rogers is his press secretary. Don Rogers was Curtin's press secretary during the war and served him admirably. Don Rogers stayed on with Chifley. He was a man who could work the media. He was respected by journalists. He was respected by business and both sides of politics. The first that Don Rogers knows that this is taking place is when Chifley emerges from his office with the press release, handwritten press release, and says, "Get this out, Don. I think the boys might find something of interest here." Don Rogers was absolutely astonished, but followed the Prime Minister's direction and handed it out. Now, it's all the more surprising. So not only did Chifley have this very accomplished press secretary who in his time would be seen as the model for future Prime Minister or press secretaries, but Chifley as Treasurer had overseen some of the most successful war bond drives during the war. So he knew what a campaign looked like. He knew all the component parts. So it remains a mystery. Perhaps the closest I can think of why this happened is his biographer, LCF Crisp, who knew Chifley personally, who said once Chifley settled on an idea, he sort of closed the book and he was more intent on executing it rather than persuading people about the benefits of it.
It must have seemed to Robert Menzies when Chifley made this announcement like the most incredible stroke of good luck. I mean, he'd been, waiting for something. He'd been saying that Chifley was a socialist, a communist, tendencies, that this was the direction Australia was going to head in under the Chifley government. And then, lo and behold, that's exactly what Chifley announces he will be doing, is nationalising the bank. And then Menzies is able to make a case that, well, they do this, then what else will they do? And then they run the whole economy and the whole of society, and you can give up on your democracy. It must have just been extraordinary from Menzies' perspective that all this landed in his lap.
And overnight. So if you have a look in August 1947, the Liberal and Country parties have lost the election the year before. The Labor Party has an overwhelming majority in the Senate and a very, very comfortable majority in the House. The Liberal and the Country parties are struggling to gain traction. As you said, Prime Minister Chifley is popular and the Labor government is very much in control and it's into an historic third term. Chifley's Bank Nationalisation statement on the 16th of August 1947, leaving Parliament House at 1 p.m, shifts the dynamics almost instantly. For the opposition, it's like rain after a summer's drought. Menzies had been telling Australians for 5 years, and, one reflects on his Forgotten Australian speech in 1942, in which he's laying out the Liberal philosophy. He's been telling Australians for 5 years that Labor governments are predisposed to central control, state regimentation and socialism. So Chifley's bank statement now provides irrefutable proof that Menzies has been right all along. So this is an opportunity for Menzies to rally those forgotten people, oppose the government, and personally to make a political comeback.
So, Bob, tell me about the Liberal Party's running their campaign, and you've gone through that, led by Richard Casey, of course, and using a lot of American-style campaign techniques and communication techniques. But the banks obviously play an enormously important role here. It's against their interest to be nationalised. They want to remain private banks and operate on their own terms and no doubt make lots of money. Tell me how they orchestrated their campaign, because there were quite big differences economically, culturally, politically between, say, the major centres of Sydney and Melbourne, weren't there?
Yes, there were. So in 1947, you've got 8 private banks and you've got a couple of smaller banks. They're worth £1 billion. They're servicing 1.5 million customers. Now, you've got 2 different cultures. You've got 2 banks in Sydney, led by the Bank of New South Wales, which is the largest bank in Australia, which takes a more constitutional approach in its opposition. It casts the fight against bank nationalisation as a political, constitutional issue. You've got the remainder of the banks headquartered in Melbourne, and they take a different viewpoint. They focus on what it means to the individual Australian and his or her liberty and economic freedom. So they're pitching, the Melbourne banks are pitching it very much as a private enterprise personal freedom initiative. And their campaigns are loosely coordinated, but they're quite different. The 2 sets of banks split up Australia. The Bank of New South Wales and the Commercial Bank of Sydney say we'll take care of New South Wales and Queensland. There's a Bank of Adelaide, which is a prominent bank but only operates in South Australia. They take care of South Australia. And the Melbourne banks take care of the West. When they meet a couple of weeks after the announcement in a group called the Associated Banks, those 8 general managers sit down and they work out a campaign with 2 objectives. The first objective is to defeat bank nationalisation, and that's their immediate thing. And they know from Chifley's history that they might defeat bank nationalisation, but as long as Labor is in power, the idea will not go away. So they set out to bring about the defeat of the ALP government.
And I guess on top of that, Bob, they also want to ensure that Labor doesn't try this again, that they don't feel like, yes, they lost this time, but they've got to keep that in their policy, manifesto for another day, because in the end, the banks see this as an existential issue. So they've got to ensure it is completely and utterly defeated once and for all, never to return again, don't they?
That's right. And with these 2 objectives, to defeat bank nationalisation and then the long term to defeat the Labor government, they institute a campaign which Labor at the time estimated, Arthur Caldwell estimated, was worth $100 million in today's terms.
That's the equivalent of a Clive Palmer campaign, isn't it?
That is,
or a Simon Holmes a Court campaign.
Even today, it's massive. It has 3 components to it. There's a legal issue. They employ the best silks in the land to fight the issue in the court. They conduct their own media and advertising campaigns. And what's not often reported, they set up and they support grassroots organisation right across the continent to agitate locally. And in the end, they win. And even today, when you look back, a most successful campaign which then for decades became a template for other threatened industries to follow, right up and such things as gambling, mining, etc. Until very recently, say the last 20 years, when things changed with social media, they had taken on board, that threatened industries tended to take on board the bare bones essentials of what those post-war bankers conceived and so brilliantly executed.
Yeah, that's amazing that it was such a resilient campaign style until the age of social media. Bob, I'm really interested in the role of church leaders in the anti-bank nationalisation campaigns because, I mean, we're speaking today the day after the Pope has passed, and of course there's a lot of outpourings of grief about the passing of the leader of the Catholic Church. These figures, church leaders in the 1940s, had huge moral and actual political clout over the community, didn't they? So, I mean, it's interesting. These days you don't see church leaders getting so deeply involved in political issues. I mean, we're talking here, bank nationalisation, it's an economic issue fundamentally. But back in the 40s, a church leader would quite often get involved in the sort of nitty-gritty of a political issue, wouldn't they? And then ends up sort of betraying a bit of partisanship and political bias, doesn't it?
Yes, in fact, the attitude of the churches is quite significant. The Anglican, the Presbyterian and churches on that side of the aisle, they come out against this as they move towards regimentation and socialism. The Catholic Church, which we traditionally in those days associate with the Labor Party, damns the move almost by its silence. They come out and say, well, this is very interesting. We'll have to see how this unfolds. But there is no support. There is one prelate, Monsignor Thomas O'Donnell, who works in the Hobart Cathedral, and he takes to the airwaves and takes to the newspaper columns to condemn in the strongest possible terms what the Chifley government is doing. Quite by coincidence, when he gives his first sermon, oh my goodness, in the front row, there's all the journalists from the Tasmanian newspapers. So I've got a theory, yet to be substantiated, that although the church, people like Cardinal Gilroy, who was the head of the church, and Danny Mannix, were very careful about what they said, Thomas O'Donnell may have been given free rein to really savage the government with the tacit approval of the bishops.
I've got a quote from that particular sermon here, Bob, I'm going to read out because it's vicious. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary that a church leader would say this type of thing about the government. The Federal Labor Party, unconsciously bent on the destruction of Australian liberty, is forging chains for the limbs of our people. To seize the bank is to seize the property and the rights of hundreds of small shareholders. It would be the first step towards making Australia a totalitarian state and its people slaves.
Strong words.
Yeah. I mean, quite extraordinary. And as you say, the fact that the Hobart Press Gallery, for what it was, I mean, maybe huge, was in attendance at that particular sermon is it's a very, very convenient coincidence if that's what it was. The bank nationalisation obviously dies a death with the defeat of the Chifley government in December 1949, and of course election of the Menzies government. The Liberal National Country Party, then National Party coalition, is in government until 1972 for 23 years. Just an extraordinary period. I think will be unrivalled in the future. But do you think bank nationalisation was always destined to fail? Was it just always going to be too hard to sell?
I think it was always going to be a very difficult thing to sell because it was at the start of the Cold War. And it was very easy for opponents of bank nationalisation to label this as a Soviet-style takeover. You've got, in the same period, post-war industrial unrest and strikes. You've got the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. At the same time, you've got the communist takeover of power in China. So against this backdrop, it is very, very hard to sell for Mr. Chifley and his government. Yet there is, Georgina, coming at it from a public relations, marketing, advertising perspective, they were simply outgunned, outspent and out-strategised. And the old way of conducting union politics and communications by 1949 had been overtaken by mass communications and advertising as we know it today.
Do you think, though, there is an inherent conservatism in the Australian electorate? They were reticent to embrace radical change. I mean, that's sort of been pretty much our political experience in the post-war era, really since Federation. We really have been more in favour of incremental changes rather than a dramatic change to the system.
Yes, and this was one of the most dramatic changes almost overnight. Now, those that followed politics knew that Labor had this on its agenda, since more or less the end of the First World War. But you had to follow politics. So if you woke up and saw the newspapers on the 17th of August 1947, for most Australians this came as a complete shock. And I think there's a few things. If Australian politicians have bold ideas, they need to be very carefully thought through. They need to be supported by persuasive communications, evidence-based argument, and consistent communications. Chifley did not do this. His government played catch-up after his very bold announcement. I think the lesson for me is people need to see a clear individual and community benefit in what's being proposed, and no government, no matter how successful it has been, and up until this point, the Curtin and then the Chifley governments had been very successful. They'd won 43 and 46 elections, and they were regarded with affection. No matter how successful they have been, if they're introducing bold ideas, they just cannot sit back and rely on a parliamentary record, a parliamentary majority or a past record. That's the lesson in this for me. The other thing in it for me is that an industry, if it feels it's under threat, will always find ways to resist and to fight for its survival. And the banking industry is a good example of this. Traditionally, they had kept in a narrow lane. They'd gone about their business of banking. They ditched tradition in 1947 and they went on the offensive openly against Chifley's legislation to ensure their survival. They bankrolled local groups, they funded agitators, they engaged in their own campaign. So I think Australians prefer incremental change, but if a government wants to introduce such a radical departure, they really need to think about this well beforehand and not make it up as they go along. And that was what I think the Chifley government did. They knew what they wanted to do, but they didn't have the communications infrastructure or planning or expertise to support them.
And really, politics is the art of persuasion, and Chifley was found wanting there. So, Bob Crawshaw, thank you so much for bringing the Battle of the Banks to Afternoon Light. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear a different perspective on a period in history we often talk about, but a really fascinating one. So, thank you. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.